Hi there, and welcome to Chapter 11. We are now at Adolescence in the Lifespan. Chapter 11 talks about physical and cognitive development for teenagers. And so Erickson says that the ages of adolescence are 12 to 18. Different psychologists and physicians do have different timelines on what constitutes adolescence in terms of age, because marking the beginning of adolescence or even determining the end of adolescence can be a little difficult to do and may depend on the individual. But one thing that we know about adolescence for sure is that it's definitely a transitional period for most people. One of the main elements of adolescence is puberty. And puberty is defined as a relatively abrupt and qualitatively different set of physical changes that normally occur at the beginning of the teen years. Another thing that occurs during adolescence that we're going to focus on are some major life events, like finishing school, graduating, taking SATs, starting your first job, potentially even starting college. So when we discuss what marks the beginning of adolescence, and there's that debate on, is it 12, is it 13, is it earlier, is it 11, when does adolescence start? A lot of people point to puberty as the onset of adolescence, but the problem with that is that different people start puberty at different times, so it makes it difficult to pinpoint an age at which adolescence starts. When we discuss puberty, one of the main things that we need to look at is what's known as menarche. And so menarche is referring to the female's onset of menstruation. And we know that menarche can happen between 8 and 16, but the deal is that we wouldn't say that an 8-year-old is an adolescent, for example. So the most reliable mark of the onset of adolescence is considered to be the development of 4 hormones that most affect sexuality. For females, those hormones are progesterone and estrogen, and for males, those hormones are testosterone and androgens. The leading psychologist on adolescence for a long time and historically was a gentleman by the name of G. Stanley Hall. He's considered the father of adolescent psychology because he wrote a very famous book in 1904 called Adolescence. He developed this term that is very popular still today, which is storm and stress. And what he means by storm and stress is that most teens are by nature moody, and what he even said is untrustworthy. And there is some support for his idea of storm and stress nowadays because of our ability to measure hormones and look inside the brain and see the activity and the development of the structures. And so we know that increased brain activity in the prefrontal cortex is something that occurs in adolescence. And because the prefrontal cortex is the part of the brain that we use for judgment, decision making, problem solving, emotional regulation, it kind of goes under construction during the time where there's the increased brain activity. It's still forming, it's still developing. And so this can create a lot of confusion for the adolescent. We also know that hormones are really running rampant during this time because of the changes within the body related to puberty. And this can cause irrational behavior within the teen and even antisocial behavior within the teen. So Hall was praised for work that he had done on adolescence, but he was a little extreme in his views. So while there is now some support for his ideas of storm and stress, maybe he took it a little too far with some of his ideas. For example, in his book Adolescence, he talked a lot about the plague of masturbation. He even told teachers to beat high school children that they suspected of masturbating. So certainly there were some good ideas and some bad ideas that G. Stanley Hall had when it came to adolescence. So this is Anna Freud, Sigmund Freud's daughter, and she had her own theories of what occurs during adolescence. She says that it all starts back in the latency period of her father's psychosexual stages theory. And so in the latency period, this is when children are not experiencing any crisis in their sexuality, but instead boys are playing with boys, girls are playing with girls, and there is no focus of libido during this time. And she says during this time, children begin to adopt moral values and figure out who they identify with. For instance, what similar characteristics they look for in friends. But it's actually in this time that they start experiencing feelings of guilt more profoundly than ever before. But they often internalize those feelings of guilt, thinking that they're bad people or that they're not good, that they're bad in some way. And then in puberty, a little bit after middle childhood, the id becomes dominant. And the id is that part of the unconscious mind that is interested in sexual urges and getting what it wants when it wants it and not caring about the rules of society. It's very animalistic, very emotional. A lot of impulses and urges that are sort of uncontrollable exist within the id, particularly sexual urges. And so because the id becomes dominant, according to Anna Freud, during puberty, this creates a really deep internal conflict between these morals that they had just developed during the latency period and these urges of the id. And so guilt is a very big theme during adolescence, according to Anna Freud, because of this conflict between morals and the id. And so this conflict causes regression, a renewed Oedipal complex, Anna Freud argues, anxiety, and then use of those ego defense mechanisms that we had discussed earlier. Two additional ego defense mechanisms begin appearing in adolescence, according to Anna Freud, and they are asceticism and intellectualization. So, asceticism is defense against the sexual drives of youth by becoming extremely religious and devoted to God. So, it's sort of like trying to ignore the id and repress those feelings of the id by focusing on God or religion. And then the other defense mechanism that Anna Freud says that teens use is intellectualization. And this is defending against emotionality of all kinds by becoming extremely intellectual and logical about life. So, in other words, it's trying to repress any emotions that you might have, guilt being one of them. Okay, the next theory of adolescence, and possibly the most popular theory of adolescence, comes from Erik Erikson, who argues that the main task of adolescence is to achieve a state of identity. Figure out who you are, what you stand for, your strengths, your weaknesses, your moral ideas, your political and religious affiliations, your likes, your dislikes, your standards, your boundaries. And so he says that there are several different components to this development of identity. And the first of which is the state of identity, which is achieving who we strive to be, which he says is the main goal of adolescence. And if we don't achieve this, then we experience role confusion, and this leaves us open to peer pressure, manipulation by others, feeling confused on our direction in life. And so he says, if we don't achieve this identity crisis, state of identity, then we experience identity crisis. And those are situations that cause us to make major decisions about our identity. I don't know if I want to major in history or fine arts. I got to pick one and then just going with whatever, just so that you have some type of direction. But maybe it's not really based on who you are or who you want to be as a person. Erikson also believed that to discover your true identity, you have to do something called repudiate, or go into a state of repudiation. And this is committing to one identity, one lifestyle, and giving up all other possibilities. People who are unsuccessful at this are always thinking the grass is greener, so they keep options open. For example, they might be unfaithful to a spouse, can't keep a job, no loyalty to friends. Erikson also suggests that to find our identity during adolescence, we may want to engage in what he referred to as a psychological moratorium, which is actually practiced in some other countries in Europe, but not something that we really encourage in our country as of yet. But a psychological moratorium is a period where a teen explores different lifestyle choices before forming an identity. And so maybe before you decide on a major in college, you try out different hobbies, or you volunteer at different organizations. Maybe you travel around the world. You get some experience before you settle on a career or a big component of your identity. But Erickson says that if a teen cannot stand ambiguity during this moratorium, they may make the mistake of doing what's known as a premature foreclosure. And so this is just settling on something because you can't really handle not knowing during the moratorium. And Erickson argues that this can cause regrets later in life or even identity confusion. But Erickson does say that it's not healthy to stay in the moratorium too long, that we do need to make choices eventually. And finally, Erickson argues that one of the components of adolescence, something we see in a lot of teens, is idealism, which is the pursuit of perfection or some standard that really represents your highest goal or your highest potential. And so teens are idealistic because it's necessary, according to Erickson, so that they can commit to one ideology and build their personal values around it. It's like they're trying out all of these different ideas of how their life could be perfect, and then ultimately settling on one style and then adapting to make that style or that idea more realistic, because perfection obviously is not realistic. But these ideas allow them to integrate their beliefs within all facets of their personality to develop a sort of continuity. If this doesn't happen, then something called disintegration of personality can occur, which is where you have kind of different parts of your personality pulling you in different directions, and the different parts of your personality don't actually line up in their ideas on how life should look. And this, according to Erickson, can be the basis of mental illness. Okay, another psychologist by the names of James Marcia expanded on Erickson's ideas and introduced what's known as identity status. And so there are two factors that are essential to gaining this mature identity status. First, a person must go through crises where they choose among life's alternatives. For example, stay religious or don't stay religious. Second, the person must come to some type of commitment, investing in themselves and their choices, and following through on those choices. Depending on if these two situations go well or not, a person can develop one of the four following statuses. The first is identity confusion, which is no crisis and no commitment. The second is identity foreclosure. There's no crisis, but commitments have been made. The third is identity moratorium, which is where there is crisis, but there's no commitment. And then finally, there is identity achievement. And this is when a crisis has been experienced and commitments have been made. So in other words, it's believed that these crises that we experience in our teen years are necessary towards our development. But ultimately, we need to make some type of commitment on who we are going to be as people and follow through on that commitment. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video here, go to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 1, and then return to this point in the video. Okay, so one of the major changes in adolescence that really makes adolescence a transitional period is puberty. And like we talked about before, should we consider puberty to be the beginning of adolescence? Some people say yes, some people say no. So it's definitely a concept worth exploring to better understand how this affects development. In terms of biologically, what triggers puberty is this hormonal balance. And so it's a change in hormones that ultimately indicate the onset of puberty and potentially the onset of adolescence. So this hormonal balance or these hormonal changes cause skeletal growth, genital growth, breast development, pubic hair, change in voice, growth spurt, and a variety of other emotional side effects. In terms of females, menarche has been suggested as the onset of puberty for girls, from doctors or sometimes even psychologists. And what we find is that most girls actually don't remember menarche or think of it as a particularly significant event in their life. But we do know that hormonal changes happen about 2 years before menarche occurs. Remember that menarche is the girl's first period. And then spermarchy is considered the first ejaculation for males, and it is sometimes considered the onset of puberty for them. Many men don't remember spermarchy or they repress it, but we know that it usually occurs during the nighttime while they're asleep, and this is referred to as nocturnal emission. Research shows that many children are not prepared intellectually or emotionally for menarche or spermarchy, and it can be viewed as negative or even frightening, just depending on the individual. When it comes before 11 years old, there is actually a correlation to depression and substance abuse for those children. Another major phenomenon that we see going on regarding puberty is known as the secular trend, which is a phenomenon of adolescents entering puberty sooner and growing heavier and taller. So let's go ahead and watch this video on the secular trend.
Studies are showing girls are hitting puberty earlier and earlier. What is going on out there? Howdy guys and gals, Trace here for D News, and I think we can all agree puberty is terrible. You want to start like talking to girls and your voice gets all crackly, hey there, Janice. Or maybe you want boys to notice how nice you look and your body is going through all these weird changes and acne is popping up and awkwardly sized everything. Now, a long-term study following 1,200 girls in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco has some troubling results. Girls are starting puberty younger than ever before, and we don't really know why. The study published in the journal Pediatrics explains that in the 1990s, African American girls were developing breasts at about age 9. Hispanic girls were a few months later, and while white and Asian girls began developing breasts at about 9.5. Today, they show girls are developing breasts 4 months earlier than in '97, and that is a huge change over such a short time. So why this time shift? Obesity, really, according to the researchers. They write that heavier girls start puberty earlier, but added that there are literally hundreds of chemicals which could be causing this shift. Other experts weighed in, claiming obesity was unlikely to be the only cause, and that where girls live and how much meat and dairy they have in their diet will also affect puberty onset. Even family stress has changed pubertal timing. Some of the more sensationalized chemicals known to cause estrogen activation are BPAs or bisphenol A, found in some plastic drink bottles, and 34 of the 200 NIH-tested pesticides contained estrogen-mimicking compounds. Chemicals on furniture like brominated flame retardants can be absorbed through the skin and could be yet another cause of this. Again, literally hundreds of chemicals, and we don't know. In the past, there have been stories about hormones in the water supply. It seems to have hit the presses in the late aughts, focusing on how hormones from birth control pills were finding their way back into our kids and food sources. In reality, a study in 2011 found otherwise. Sewage treatment plants remove virtually all EE2, which is the main estrogen compound in contraception, but cattle are given 5 times the dosage, and hormones like plant estrogen, known as phytoestrogen, are found in soy products, nuts, grains, and meats, which then brings us all the way back to diet. Some blogs are reporting moms being more stringent with their kids' meat and dairy to eliminate at least that source of possible contamination. Regardless though, the obesity and diet factors are major, and many of the experts agree on that, with all agreeing that more research is needed and fast. So what can science do about this really? For the moment, nothing, because we don't know what's causing it. But what do you think about studies like this? Are we just evolving to be more mature younger, or are we missing something in our food regulations? What should we do? Tell us your thoughts on our Facebook page. And guys, could you tell us how we're doing here on D News? Do you have any suggestions for how we can improve? We read your comments and we try and do our best for you, but as we come up on our 1-year anniversary, it's time to ask you directly. So I present the D News Audience Survey. Please take a few minutes and give us some feedback. The link is in the description. So go ahead and go down there. And if you do, thanks so much.
One of the main issues for a lot of teenagers in their physical development and emotional development is their body image. And so there's a lot of pressure that teenagers feel from the media and from their peers to look a certain way. And if they don't look that certain way, it tends to take a toll on their self-esteem and their behavior and how they feel about themselves. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video on body image during adolescence.
I'm so unhappy with myself. And the world is so shallow that it's taught me that my body is who I am. My appearance is who I am. But I don't like the me inside.
I always want to get bigger, more cut, more defined, everything. I'm never usually satisfied with my body image.
I always feel like I can get stronger and bigger. I actually feel like I still need to get bigger.
I don't think any teenager can look in the mirror and say that they love themselves completely.
It's just constantly on everyone's mind.
Everyone's worried about what other people think about you.
What they say and think kind of influences how you feel about yourself.
I had one friend who I was really close with who was a horrible influence on me to begin with, but she actually would tell me that I was fat and that I was the fatter one.
You start thinking all the time in your head, I'm fat, I'm fat, I'm fat.
And after a while, if you really think that, you're gonna start seeing it.
Some of the influence comes from their peers, but I think most of it's from media, like magazines or television.
The most common diet mistakes: how to look 5 pounds thinner.
It's not a health magazine, that's a way to make money.
You're not sitting there thinking, oh, that's airbrush, oh, that's fixed. You're not thinking about that, you're thinking about, why don't I look that way? And it does make you feel really bad.
You see the way that they look, they have the muscles, they're popular, and you're just like, maybe I need to look like that.
Whenever they close up on any of the players, like basketball players or football players, you see them, you look at their arms and their bodies, it's like you just see nothing but muscle.
And they think, okay, if I gotta succeed, I gotta be that big.
And they think they can't do it naturally, so they use steroids.
For us to worry about our body image 24/7 is not really good for anybody because it makes us lose focus on other things that we have going on in life.
I would start hiding food. I'd be like, oh, I'm getting this piece of pizza for my friend, but in reality, I knew it was for me because I just didn't want to be judged.
Probably lost 10 pounds of body weight, and everybody's like, your shirt used to be tighter, what happened to you?
You tend to lose control and you feel like your body is the only thing you can control.
And I think that that's why I take it out on my body, because it's so much more straightforward.
Everything else becomes so distant for you and you can't focus on anything.
And you really don't think about the future, you think of the present, it won't mess up my life, and really it will.
It becomes an obsession. You're never good enough for yourself.
Okay, so one of the issues that can result from a poor body image is eating disorders, and we do see a relatively high prevalence of this in adolescence. What we know about eating disorders is that 1/3 of people with either anorexia or bulimia do in fact die from the disease. And so let's take a look at the difference between anorexia nervosa and bulimia. Anorexia nervosa is a condition in which a person reduces eating to the point that a weight loss of 15% below the ideal body weight or more occurs. It's a severe eating disorder in which people may refuse to eat while denying that their behavior and appearance are unusual. And this might be to what's known as body dysmorphic disorder, like you see in the picture for anorexia here. When they look in the mirror, they don't see themselves as they actually are. Instead, there's this exaggerated discrepancy. They might be very thin, but see themselves as larger. We know that 10% of people with anorexia starve themselves to death. Adolescents account for 95% of anorexic cases. People with this disorder do typically come from stable homes. They are often attractive and successful, and some psychologists theorize that this might be, the anorexia might be due to this ongoing pursuit of perfection that maybe comes with these other factors: stable homes, attractive, successful parents, successful in school. They need to kind of keep this ideal going by maintaining what they consider a perfect body image. And so when we see anorexia onset, it usually starts when a diet gets out of control. And when someone is anorexic, it's very often less about food and more about this need for control. In some cases, we have seen that when people are anorexic, it's really their idea is that this is really the only facet of their life in which they have control. If they put food in their mouth or don't put food in their mouth is one area of their life where they feel like they absolutely have full control over. Another kind of sign of someone who may be anorexic is a preoccupation with food, ironically enough. People that are anorexic often will cook for others, they'll shop for food frequently, they'll collect cookbooks, and while they're centering their lives around food, they're not eating it. But the reason that they're really centering their lives around food is because they're consumed with this idea of food and avoiding it and standing in the face of it and resisting temptation. The other disorder we're going to discuss is bulimia. And so bulimia is a condition in which a person develops a cycle of binging, which is overeating enormous amounts of food at one sitting, and then using unhealthy methods to purge that food. It might be laxatives, it might be making themselves vomit. And so one of the main side effects of bulimia is tooth decay. If you look at the teeth, you might see that they're kind of rotted, and this is because when a person vomits a lot, the acidity in the stomach eats away at the enamel on the teeth. And then a more profound side effect is heart failure, due to this just abnormal functioning that you're requiring the body to do. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video on eating disorders.
High school is a rocky time. Teenagers are being faced with various pressures. The pressure to fit in, be a star student, get involved, please their parents. These pressures and the message displayed by the media that thin is in are causing many people to strive to be dangerously skinny. Unfortunately, many times these pressures and messages can lead to the development of an eating disorder. An eating disorder is a mental disorder involving a serious disturbance in normal eating behavior. Eating disorders have the highest mortality rate out of any other mental disorder. An estimated 10 million females and 1 million males are affected by eating disorders yearly. 15 to 19-year-olds, high school students, make up 40% of all cases of eating disorders. Unfortunately, from June 2011 to June 2012, there was an estimated 16% increase in hospitalized cases of eating disorders. Eating disorders can range from anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, to binge eating or any combination of these forms. This is a tragic epidemic. We need to take further action in stopping the rise of eating disorders before they develop or worsen. And what better place to intervene than one of the greatest triggers of eating disorders, school. Wayzata High School currently has a one-term health class requirement. It includes eating disorders education within its curriculum. However, due to time constraints, the unit is often unfairly cut short. Even worse, it is frequently reported that learning about eating disorders in a classroom setting can have iatrogenic effects on students, meaning that the exposure of such information inadvertently encourages them to develop an eating disorder. However, if more specific standards and regulations can be created that encourage more class time instruction focused on healthy eating disorder education and prevention, perhaps our schools can help nip eating disorders in the bud. According to the Minnesota Department of Education, local school boards have the right to determine their own standards for health education. It also states that the goal of health education and physical education programs in Minnesota is to offer students educational opportunities that promote healthy, lifelong lifestyle decisions. In order for these goals to be reached, the curriculum of eating disorders education needs to be enhanced. This can be done through the school board's passing of standards regarding eating disorder education that allows a greater amount of proper information to be taught to the most susceptible of demographics, high school students. This is not an issue that can be overlooked any longer. Wayzata Public Schools District 284 School Board needs to take action now. There are simply too many lives at stake to remain inactive.
Let's take a look at Piaget's cognitive development theory in terms of adolescence. We know that teens have growth spurts in the parietal and frontal lobes, which during adolescence, which changes the quality of the teen's thinking and how they look and understand the world. And so in this formal operational stage, which is what Piaget calls 12 years to adulthood, this stage is really characterized by abstract thought, being able to consider hypotheticals in a more unique and sophisticated way, like which comes first, the chicken or the egg, where a younger child might not be able to participate in that exercise, an adolescent certainly can because of their ability to engage in abstract thought. They use logical techniques to solve problems, so they start being able to kind of research and in a scientific type of way look for factors that affect and don't affect outcomes and problem solve in a way that kids really can't. One of the examples of this is what Piaget referred to as the pendulum problem. And so the question that Piaget would propose to adolescents in this stage is, what determines how fast a pendulum swings? Is it the length of the string? Is it the weight of the pendulum? Is it the force of the pendulum? And what he found was that children in the concrete stage had no rational plan to solve this. They would just manipulate the string, weight, and the force of pushing the pendulum all at once. Whereas people in the formal operational stage, teenagers, would examine one variable at a time, eliminating options, like a scientist, very systematically until they got the right answer. So let's go ahead and take a look at the formal operational stage in this video.
The formal operational stage of cognitive development is reached when an adolescent begins to think abstractly and to reason hypothetically. When asked the hypothetical question, "What if people had no thumbs?" pre-adolescent children like Jalur and Jenny respond much differently than adolescents do.
We just have 4 fingers. Wouldn't be able to write or nothing.
You wouldn't be able to tell a person that they're like good and this.
That's good.
And wouldn't be able to write really good. And you couldn't play thumb wrestling.
Adolescents are able to mentally picture this hypothetical situation, contrast it with reality, and produce a variety of conclusions regarding the implications of being without thumbs.
Man, I think the whole world would change, kind of. I know a friend of mine who's a lefty, and in 5th grade we were just shooting the breeze one day, and she said, "You know, the whole world's made for righties." I said, "What are you talking about, the whole world's made for righties?" She said, "Well, door handles all open a certain way, tables are made a certain way, desks in school are all made for righties. You'll notice that when you get in, you can prop your right arm up but not your left one." And sort of for the next week or so I kept my eye out, and she was right. I mean, the whole world is sort of tailored to the majority, the righties. And so I think if we were to lose something as simple but critical as our thumb, the whole world would change. Maybe a bunch of little things, but all those little things would add up to something major, and I think the whole world would be different.
Another fun fact about the formal operational stage is that it's estimated that 40 to 60% of adults never actually reach this stage. Okay, let's go ahead and pause the video here and then head on over to Moodle, complete lecture activity number 2, and come back to this point when you're finished. So G. Stanley Hall talked about how adolescence is a period of storm and stress. And like we discussed, there is some scientific support for this idea. And what's cited as the reason for this storm and stress is both the hormones that accompany puberty and brain development. So, as we've mentioned previously, I think, the frontal lobe of the brain doesn't fully develop until we are 25. And again, the frontal lobe contains the centers of the brain that are responsible for judgment, social inhibition, emotional regulation, decision-making, problem-solving. And so when we get into our teen years, we see a reemergence of the frontal lobe development. In other words, the frontal lobe kind of goes under construction. And so during this time, those capabilities, judgment, problem-solving, regulating emotions, like impulsivity, for example, they tend to suffer because of the frontal lobe not working properly or as it does at our older ages. Another thing that we see occur that also affects the emotions in this period of storm and stress are something called spindle cells. And these develop rapidly during adolescence, and they play a large role in our emotions. They send socially relevant signals across the brain, and they're not present at birth, but they do gradually appear as children develop concepts of moral and social judgments. And what's interesting is only few animals have these spindle cells. We've only been able to identify them in humans and great apes. Okay, let's go ahead and watch a video on the developing brain in an adolescent.
15 years ago, it was widely assumed that the vast majority of brain development takes place in the first few years of life. Back then, 15 years ago, we didn't have the ability to look inside the living human brain and track development across the lifespan. In the past decade or so, mainly due to advances in brain imaging technology such as magnetic resonance imaging or MRI, neuroscientists have started to look inside the living human brain of all ages and to track changes in brain structure and brain function. So we use structural MRI, if you like, to take a snapshot, a photograph at really high resolution of the inside of the living human brain. And we can ask questions like, how much grey matter does the brain contain, and how does that change with age? And we also use functional MRI, called fMRI, to take a video, a movie, of brain activity when participants are taking part in some kind of task, like thinking or feeling or perceiving something. So many labs around the world are involved in this kind of research, and we now have a really rich and detailed picture of how the living human brain develops. And this picture has radically changed the way we think about human brain development by revealing that it's not all over in early childhood, and instead, the brain continues to develop right throughout adolescence and into the 20s and 30s. So adolescence is defined as the period of life that starts with the biological, hormonal, physical changes of puberty and ends at the age at which an individual attains a stable, independent role in society. It can go on a long time. One of the brain regions that changes most dramatically during adolescence is called prefrontal cortex. So this is a model of the human brain, and this is prefrontal cortex right at the front. Prefrontal cortex is an interesting brain area. It's proportionally much bigger in humans than in any other species, and it's involved in a whole range of high-level cognitive functions, things like decision-making, planning what you're going to do tomorrow or next week or next year. Inhibiting inappropriate behavior, so stopping yourself saying something really rude or doing something really stupid. It's also involved in social interaction, understanding other people, and self-awareness. So MRI studies looking at the development of this region have shown that it really undergoes dramatic development during the period of adolescence. So if you look at grey matter volume, for example, grey matter volume across age, from age 4 to 22 years, increases during childhood, which is what you can see on this graph. It peaks in early adolescence. The arrows indicate peak grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. You can see that that peak happens a couple of years later in boys relative to girls, and that's probably because boys go through puberty a couple of years later than girls on average. And then during adolescence, there's a significant decline in grey matter volume in prefrontal cortex. Now that might sound bad, but actually this is a really important developmental process because grey matter contains cell bodies and connections between cells, the synapses. And this decline in grey matter volume during prefrontal cortex is thought to correspond to synaptic pruning, the elimination of unwanted synapses. This is a really important process. It's partly dependent on the environment that the animal or the human is in that synapses that are being used are strengthened and synapses that aren't being used in that particular environment are pruned away. You can think of it a bit like pruning a rose bush. You prune away the weaker branches so that the remaining important branches can grow stronger. And this process, which effectively fine-tunes brain tissue according to the species-specific environment, is happening in prefrontal cortex and in other brain regions during the period of human adolescence. So a second line of inquiry that we use to track changes in the adolescent brain is using functional MRI to look at changes in brain activity across age. So I'll just give you an example from my lab. So in my lab, we're interested in the social brain. That is, the network of brain regions that we use to understand other people and to interact with other people. So I like to show a photograph of a soccer game to illustrate two aspects of how your social brains work. So this is a soccer game. Michael Owen has just missed a goal and he's lying on the ground. And the first aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates is how automatic and instinctive social emotional responses are. So within a split second of Michael Owen missing this goal, everyone is doing the same thing with their arms and the same thing with their face. Even Michael Owen, as he slides along the grass, is doing the same thing with his arms and presumably has a similar facial expression. And the only people who don't are the guys in yellow at the back. And I think they're on the wrong end of the stadium, and they're doing another social emotional response that we all instantly recognize. And that's the second aspect of the social brain that this picture really nicely illustrates, how good we are at reading other people's behavior, their actions, their gestures, their facial expressions, in terms of their underlying emotions and mental states. So you don't have to ask any of these guys, you have a pretty good idea of what they're feeling and thinking at this precise moment in time. So that's what we're interested in looking at in my lab. So in my lab, we bring adolescents and adults into the lab to have a brain scan. We give them some kind of task that involves thinking about other people, their minds, their mental states, their emotions. And one of the findings that we've found several times now, as have other labs around the world, is part of the prefrontal cortex, called medial prefrontal cortex, which is shown in blue on the slide. And it's right in the middle of prefrontal cortex, in the midline of your head. This region is more active in adolescents when they make these social decisions and think about other people than it is in adults. And this is actually a meta-analysis of 9 different studies in this area from labs around the world, and they all show the same thing, that activity in this medial prefrontal cortex area decreases during the period of adolescence. And we think that might be because adolescents and adults use a different mental approach, a different cognitive strategy to make social decisions. And one way of looking at that is to do behavioral studies, whereby we bring people into the lab and we give them some kind of behavioral task. And I'll just give you another example of the kind of task that we use in my lab. So imagine that you're the participant in one of our experiments. You come into the lab, you see this computerized task. In this task, you see a set of shelves. Now, there are objects on these shelves, on some of them, and you'll notice there's a guy standing behind the set of shelves, and there are some objects that he can't see. They're occluded from his point of view with a kind of grey piece of wood. This is the same set of shelves from his point of view. Notice that there are only some objects that he can see, whereas there are many more objects that you can see. Now, your task is to move objects around. The director, standing behind the set of shelves, is going to direct you to move objects around. But remember, he's not going to ask you to move objects that he can't see. This introduces a really interesting condition whereby there's a kind of conflict between your perspective and the director's perspective. So imagine he tells you to move the top truck left. There are 3 trucks there. You're going to instinctively go for the white truck because that's the top truck from your perspective. But then you have to remember, oh, he can't see that truck, so he must mean me to move the blue truck, which is the top truck from his perspective. Now, believe it or not, normal, healthy, intelligent adults like you make errors about 50% of the time on that kind of trial. They move the white truck instead of the blue truck. So we give this kind of task to adolescents and adults, and we also have a control condition where there's no director, and instead we give people a rule. We tell them, okay, we're going to do exactly the same thing, but this time there's no director. Instead, you've got to ignore objects with a dark grey background. You'll see that this is exactly the same condition, only in the no director condition, they just have to remember to apply this somewhat arbitrary rule, whereas in the director condition, they have to remember to take into account the director's perspective in order to guide their ongoing behavior. Okay, so if I just show you the percentage errors in a large developmental study we did, this is in a study ranging from age 7 to adulthood, and what you're going to see is the percentage errors in the adult group in both conditions. So the grey is the director condition, and you see that our intelligent adults are making errors about 50% of the time, whereas they make far fewer errors when there's no director present, when they just have to remember that rule of ignoring the grey background. developmentally, these two conditions develop in exactly the same way between late childhood and mid-adolescence. There's an improvement, in other words, a reduction of errors in both of these trials, in both of these conditions. But it's when you compare the last two groups, the mid-adolescent group and the adult group, where things get really interesting, because there is no continued improvement in the no-directed condition. In other words, everything you need to do in order to remember the rule and apply it seems to be fully developed by mid-adolescence. Whereas in contrast, if you look at the last two grey bars, there's still a significant improvement in the directed condition between mid-adolescence and adulthood. And what this means is that the ability to take into account someone else's perspective in order to guide ongoing behavior, which is something, by the way, that we do in everyday life all the time, is still developing in mid to late adolescence. So if you have a teenage son or a daughter and you sometimes think they have problems taking other people's perspectives, you're right, they do, and this is why. So we sometimes laugh about teenagers. They're parodied, sometimes even demonized in the media for their kind of typical teenage behavior. They take risks, they're sometimes moody, they're very self-conscious. I have a really nice anecdote from a friend of mine who said that the thing he noticed most about his teenage daughters before and after puberty was their level of embarrassment in front of him. So he said, before puberty, if my two daughters were messing around in a shop, I'd say, hey, stop messing around and I'll sing your favorite song. And instantly they'd stop messing around and he'd sing their favorite song. After puberty, that became the threat. The very notion of their dad singing in public was enough to make them behave. So people often ask, well, is adolescence a kind of recent phenomenon? Is it something we've invented recently in the West? And actually, the answer is probably not. There are lots of descriptions of adolescence in history that sound very similar to the descriptions we use today. So there's a famous quote by Shakespeare from The Winter's Tale, where he describes adolescence as follows. I would there were no age between 10 and 3 and 20, or that youth would sleep out the rest. For there's nothing in the between but getting wenches with child, wronging the ancient tree, stealing, fighting. He then goes on to say, having said that, would any but these boiled brains of 19 and 2 and 20 hunt in this weather? So, almost 400 years ago, Shakespeare was portraying adolescents in a very similar light to the light that we portray them in today. But today, we try to understand their behavior in terms of the underlying changes that are going on in their brain. So, for example, take risk-taking. We know that adolescents have a tendency to take risks. They do. They take more risks than children or adults, and they are particularly prone to taking risks when they're with their friends. There's an important drive to become independent from one's parents and to impress one's friends in adolescence. But now we try to understand that in terms of the development of a part of their brain called the limbic system. So I'm going to show you the limbic system in red in the slide behind me and also on this brain. So the limbic system is right deep inside the brain, and it's involved in things like emotion processing and reward processing. It gives you the rewarding feeling out of doing fun things, including taking risks. It gives you the kick out of taking risks. And this region, the regions within the limbic system, have been found to be hypersensitive to the rewarding feeling of risk-taking in adolescents compared with adults. And at the very same time, the prefrontal cortex, which you can see in blue in the slide here, which stops us taking excessive risks, is still very much in development in adolescence. So, brain research has shown that the adolescent brain undergoes really quite profound development, and this has implications for education, for rehabilitation and intervention. The environment, including teaching, can and does shape the developing adolescent brain. And yet it's only relatively recently that we have been routinely educating teenagers in the West. All four of my grandparents, for example, left school in their early adolescence. They had no choice. And that's still the case for many, many teenagers around the world today. 40% of teenagers don't have access to secondary school education. And yet, this is a period of life where the brain is particularly adaptable and malleable. It's a fantastic opportunity for learning and creativity. So what's sometimes seen as the problem with adolescence, heightened risk-taking, poor impulse control, self-consciousness, shouldn't be stigmatized. It actually reflects changes in the brain that provide an excellent opportunity for education and social development. Thank you.
that egocentrism dies off kind of in early childhood, but we do see this reemergence of it during our teen years. And so it's the reversion to the self-centered thinking patterns of childhood that sometimes do occur in the teen years. And this adolescent egocentrism accounts for a lot of the behaviors we see in teens. For example, they have a tendency to exaggerate the importance, uniqueness, and severity of social and emotional experiences. This adolescent egocentrism causes them to think that no one has ever felt the way they do about love, friends, heartaches, clothes, everything. In fact, a famous teen quote is, "You don't understand." Because this egocentrism prevents teens from being able to understand that we've all gone through this. We've all had heartbreak. We've all been the victim of gossip or other social events in life. But due to this egocentrism, they think that they're kind of the only person that suffered from this. And so we see that adolescent egocentrism peaks at age 13 and then declines slowly. There's two main components of adolescent egocentrism, which is the imaginary audience and the personal fable. So the imaginary audience is this idea that adolescents perceive, which is that the world is constantly scrutinizing their behavior and their physical appearance, thinking everyone is looking at them, talking about them, everyone's is as concerned with them as they are. So this imaginary audience can lead to this intense desire for privacy so that they can get off the stage, get away from the audience. And it also accounts for some of the irritability and mood swings that we see within teens. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of Piaget's tests for imaginary audience, which is a teenager describing a time where she felt like everyone was looking at her.
Oh Lord. Okay, I woke up in the morning and my hair was all over the place because, of course, I forgot to put in a ponytail before I went to bed. So I wake up and it's like everywhere and I couldn't contain it at all. It was very bad. And I kept looking at people like, are they looking at me? No, they're not looking at me. Yes, they are. They're looking at me. No, that was just me. Because I asked the next day and they were like, no, what was wrong with your hair? I was like, you didn't see it. It was a mess. No one really noticed.
The second component of adolescent egocentrism is the personal fable. And this is an adolescent's tendency to think of themselves in heroic or mythical terms. They exaggerate their own abilities and even more so their own invincibility, thinking that nothing bad could ever happen to them. They think that there could not possibly be an unhappy ending to their uniquely special life story. And so this personal fable is what is believed to account for risky behavior, drug use, sexual promiscuity, dangerous driving, kind of that idea that nothing bad could possibly happen to me because I am here on this earth for some unique reason. I am special. I am different than other people. So let's go ahead and take a look at a video of the reason why teens have this kind of overconfidence due to these personal fables that they hold true to themselves.
But I have some news that's not so encouraging, folks. Today's American high school students think quite highly of themselves. A new study finds that young adults today are much more likely to think they will become outstanding parents, spouses, and workers than their counterparts who grew up in the 1970s.
But that overconfidence isn't necessarily a good thing. Stacey Gleason has this report.
The confidence of youth is a given, but psychologist and author Dr. Jean Twenge says today's young people are different from students of the 1970s.
The students then were optimistic, but not tremendously so. About half of them said they thought they would be very good workers in the future, which is the top category of performance. But by 2006, the most recent year that's available, those high school students, 2/3 of them said they expected to be in that top category. You have some kids who they have a realistic view of their abilities, they'll be just fine. Then you have others maybe a little bit overly optimistic. And then you have those folks who are almost downright delusional.
Twenge says it's easy to find examples in popular culture.
My favorite example of this is the initial episode every season of American Idol, where you get the kids who just It's sad, they just can't sing. They're just awful. And when Simon tells them they can't sing, they're downright shocked because nobody's ever told them the truth about their performance really not being very good. A really good example of empty praise these days is the kids who play on the team and everybody gets a trophy. So it doesn't matter if you win or you lose, everybody gets a trophy and it's the same size.
Good job. The problem is so ubiquitous, Twangy has written a book about it called Generation Me. Today's young adults have grown up with parents, schools, and the media focused on boosting their self-esteem.
It's clear it all began with good intentions. That teachers and parents and the folks who are writing children's TV shows, they had this idea, well, feeling good about yourself, you feel good about yourself, then all these good things will happen to you. And then it wasn't based on any research, it was just based on that it sounded good. Learning to learn from your mistakes is such a key part of becoming a teenager and becoming an adult.
Due to the formal operational stage and the ability to engage in abstract thought and logical reasoning, we really see a surge in critical and creative thinking abilities during adolescence. So we're going to take a look at the different types of thinking. The first is known as convergent thinking, and this can be thought of as kind of critical thinking or more standard thinking. And so convergent thinking is thinking used to find one correct answers, and this is what critical thinkers use. It's used when we solve problems by following a series of steps that lead us to one correct answer. For example, math formulas, geometry principles, or the Tower of Hanoi puzzle, which you see here on the slide. So you can go ahead and try to figure out how to solve the Tower of Hanoi puzzle. The rules are that only one disk can be moved at a time, and no disk can cover a smaller disk. What you're trying to do is get all 3 disks onto post 3 in the same order that you see them there on post 1. So we are working on that first board on the left, but it's just giving you an example of what it should look like when you're finished on the board to the right. So again, you can only move one larger disk, you can only move one disk at a time. No larger disk can ever cover a smaller disk. And because there's only one way to do this, and there's only one right answer, you'll have to rely on your convergent thinking abilities to accomplish this. Okay, the next type of thinking is divergent thinking, and this is thinking used when a problem to be solved has many possible answers. The problem is that not all divergent thinking is correct or creative, but personal opinion is allowed wherein convergent thinking, personal opinion, subjectivity is not allowed. And so it makes it hard to test for divergent thinking. For example, we might ask someone, what do you use a newspaper for? And if we're expecting them to engage in convergent thinking, then on the test we're expecting them to mark read it. But a divergent thinker might not ever write down the word read it. In fact, in one case study where we asked a child to answer what is a newspaper for, he listed 1,000 different ways to use a newspaper, none of which were read it. He listed things like put it on your bike, on the wheels so it makes noises when they turn, use it as wrapping paper, use it for moving, put it in your hamster cage, but never once did he say read it. Also, if we were to ask a question like what would be different if it were to rain up instead of down? Younger kids couldn't really answer this question. They would say, well, it doesn't rain up, so that's a silly question. Whereas teens are now able to engage in this type of divergent thinking, and they might be able to play along, saying something like, well, we'd have to wear umbrellas on our feet, or some kind of abstract hypothetical solution. Okay, so divergent thinking is associated with creative thinking. So let's take a look at creativity, which is the ability to generate original ideas or solve problems in novel ways. And it is hard to determine why some people are more creative than others. But what we do know is that creative people generally have what's known as cognitive complexity, which is a preference for intricate, elaborate, and complex stimuli and thinking patterns. They often have a wider range of interests. Creative people tend to be more independent and they are more interested in philosophical questions or abstract problems, like what would it be like if it were to rain up instead of down. Okay, let's go ahead and watch a video on creative or divergent thinking. Oh, by the way, the answer to the Tower of Hanoi puzzle is move disk C to post 3, then you would move disk B to post 2, then you would move disk C to post 2, then disk A to post 3, C to 1, B to 3, and then C to 3. Okay, now for the video.
There was a great study done recently of divergent thinking. Published a couple of years ago. Divergent thinking isn't the same thing as creativity. I define creativity as the process of having original ideas that have value. Divergent thinking isn't a synonym, but it's an essential capacity for creativity. It's the ability to see lots of possible answers to a question, lots of possible ways of interpreting a question, to think what Edward de Bono would probably call laterally, to think not just in linear or convergent ways, to see multiple answers, not one. So, I mean, there are tests for this. I mean, one kind of cod example would be people might be asked to say, how many uses can you think of for a paperclip? One of those routine questions. Most people might come up with 10 or 15. People who are good at this might come up with 200. And they do that by saying, well, could the paperclip be 200 foot tall and be made out of foam rubber? You know, like, does it have to be a paperclip as we know it, Jim? You know. Now, there are tests for this, and they gave them to 1,500 people. This is in a book called Breakpoint and Beyond. And on the protocol of the test, if you scored above a certain level, you'd be considered to be a genius at divergent thinking. Okay? So my question to you is, what percentage of the people tested, of the 1,500, scored at genius level for divergent thinking? Now, you need to know one more thing about them. These were kindergarten children. Okay? So what do you think? What percentage at genius level? 80. 80, okay. Isn't that great? 98%. Now, the thing about this was it was a longitudinal study. So they retested the same children 5 years later, age of 8 to 10. What do you think? 50? They retested them again 5 years later, ages 13 to 15. You can see a trend here, can't you? They tested 200,000 adults, 25 years and older, just once as a control. What do you think? Yeah. Now, I always say, if you're in business, these are the people you're hiring. Okay, the bottom? So, now, this tells an interesting story. Because you could have imagined it going the other way, couldn't you? You start off not being very good, but you get better as you get older. But this shows two things. One is we all have this capacity, and two, it mostly deteriorates. Now, a lot of things have happened to these kids as they've grown up. A lot. But one of the most important things that happened to them, I'm convinced, is that by now they've become educated. You know, they've spent 10 years at school being told there's one answer, it's at the back. And don't look. And don't copy, because that's cheating. I mean, outside schools, that's called collaboration.
So what about the intellectually gifted? What about geniuses? We do know that intelligence is not closely related with creativity, but when it comes to the intellectually gifted, we find that it is related to precociousness, which is the ability to do what others are able to do, but at a younger age. And then there's a term that you need to know, which is prodigiousness, and this is the ability to do qualitatively better than the rest of us are able to do. And this is the leading factor that leads someone to become a prodigy. And those factors that lead someone to become a prodigy are also commitment, tenacity, and joy. So we find this in people that are intellectually gifted. And intellectually gifted people constitute 2 to 4% of the population. They have IQ scores greater than 130. There is a misconception that these people that are intellectually gifted are nerdy or socially awkward. But research shows that these people are actually the most outgoing, well-adjusted, healthy, popular people. In fact, in the early 1920s, a gentleman by the name of Louis Terman followed 1,500 kids who had IQs of 140 or higher. And he actually found that members of this group were more physically, socially, and academically capable than their peers. And because this was a longitudinal study, meaning that he followed them for a significant period in their life, he also found that as adults, they earned higher incomes, they received more awards, Employee of the Month, for example, and they reported a greater satisfaction in life than non-gifted people. However, it is worth noting that not everyone in Terman's study was successful. In fact, we found that because of this study, because not everyone was successful, that a high IQ then does not guarantee success, but it certainly seems to help. Okay, let's go ahead and watch a video on the intellectually gifted. Okay, please pause the video here, go to Moodle, complete lecture activity 3, and then return for just a little bit more of chapter 11. Let's take a look at some of the mental health issues that we see arise during adolescence. Many psychologists have said that the distressing, turbulent, and unpredictable thought deemed normal in teens would actually be considered pathological in adults. And so research finds that mental health issues in adolescents are primarily caused by the identity confusion that they're experiencing that Erickson had talked about. So some statistics on mental health issues include teen suicide being the third leading cause of death in adolescence. We know that a teen commits suicide every 90 minutes. Females attempt suicide more than males, but males are 5 times more likely to commit suicide than females, which just means that males tend to be more successful at committing suicide than females are. And we know that adolescent suicide is most common amongst Caucasians. Some of the factors that are believed to lead to teen suicide include depression, perfectionists, feeling socially inhibited, being prone to extreme anxiety, alcohol and drugs, and excessive family conflict. Okay, that concludes Chapter 11 on physical and cognitive development in adolescence. We will see you for Chapter 2 on psychosocial development in adolescence. Have a great week, and don't forget to complete the journal and the forum.